My guest this evening is Professor Ray Kinsella. Ray is one of Ireland's best-known economists. He has been a professor at UCD and the University of Ulster. He has worked for the Irish Central Bank and the IMF in Washington. He is the author of several books, including his most recent, Troikanomics, Austerity, Autonomy, Existential Crisis in the European Union. Make sure to pick up a copy of that. He is also a deeply spiritual man and has as much the keen eye of the philosopher as the economist. Welcome, Professor Kinsella.
Ray, it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope our discussion invites your audience in to contribute later to make their points, because what I think isn't necessarily what a lot of people might think, but I think it's important to have a dissonant voice when you have a culture that's really incisive in Ireland. It's important, whoever it is, to have a different perspective.
Amen to that. That's absolutely true. And it's rare. And I think we're fortunate in Ireland. It's a shame that guys like yourself, and I'm thinking of Jared Casey, that you're not the mainstream, because you should be the mainstream, but also at the same time, for people like me, incredibly rich pickings when we're looking, as you say, for dissident voices. There is an incredible amount to be learned. How about, if you don't mind, Ray, a lot of the people listening to this are probably going to be economic, let's just be honest, illiterates like myself. So could we start off nice and handy? Would you be so good as to give us an overview of Irish economic development from, let's just say, where it gets interesting, the 1960s and the FDI economy, and up through the Celtic Tiger crash in the present? And I know that's very broad, but it's intentionally broad for you to dip into any areas that you think are crucial or interesting in the development of the economy.
Well, for people who know more history than I do, although I am obviously interested in economic history, Ireland's voyage from the foundation of the state has been really interesting. The government that came into office successively inherited a very difficult scenario. People forget that when T.K. Whitaker prepared, and we'll come back to him, when he was preparing the first program for economic development, and Whitaker was a giant. I mean, I remember when I was a young lad in the central bank, Whitaker had it all. But he came over from the Department of Finance to the central bank. But when he was in finance, he was preparing incoming governments for the truth, not for nationalistic blarney, but for a truth that was informed by what people in the cities and around the country, the situation they were living in. I mean, there were many families that were on the breadline. Mm-hmm. There were many families many women trying to cope with their husband and the father of the children being away in England or wherever. It was a very tough time, and I think probably the biggest service that T.K. Whitaker gave to the country was honesty and truth, but also rigorous preparation. If you were trying to cope with massive emigration, with poverty, and with a lack of morale across the country, a frustration of being aware of what people wanted to do and what they couldn't do, and letters from home. I mean, one of the interesting things in that regard was, you'd know this, was in the balance of payments statistics, there was an entry for immigrant remittances from abroad, and that was a big deal. That money,
right.
That money helped. So I think Whitaker came into an Ireland that had surmounted some difficulties, a new state, but confronted head on what needed to be done. And I do remember what I quoted earlier, that lesson he left to be learned by incoming government. The welfare of the people of Ireland will not subsist in nationalistic, and by that I mean the whole issue of, important as it is on, of unity, and it is important, but there was a kind of a caricature of what that involved. He said, no, it's
From
not
the
about
devil
that.
era years, from that inward-looking economy.
Yes, that's right. And I saw that. And he, in a very systematic way, he set about building a team, building a plan, being very realistic, beginning to encourage institutions to be set up. Now, CTT and the IDA, they had already been established, so he had something to build on, and he did build on them. And that segued into the 1960s, where anything was possible, where we got a feeling of autonomy, the respect of the world, and a can-do situation. And that's how we entered Europe. But it didn't, it fell short. At some time later, we fell off the cliff on, and we didn't manage our presence in Europe. And I think we ceded our autonomy and our capacity to do things as a country. We ceded that to basically rolling over. Now, we can come to that later. There's a
Sorry, Ray,
template on this.
I thought you would be far too young for that, but you knew T.K. Whitaker personally.
I think I gave him a lift in my car, and it was a family car on. And yeah, I remember. I have pictures in my mind and talking to you. He was a man who. Some of the girls were in school in Donnybrook, and I remember having to leave them in early, and T.K. Whitaker was going into Donnybrook Church, the Church of the Sacred Heart, where he went. He lived just up the road, and he would be there every morning. And I hauled a couple of the daughters out, and I said, "Meet a great man."
Wow.
I also saw him in the central bank, and the way he managed that role of governor of the central bank, having come over from finance. I mean, he was a good man. In the fullest sense of the word. He was a man who commanded respect as governor and in whatever roles he went on to play. But another thing about him that was extraordinary, when it came time for him to step down from the central bank and the head of the Universities of Ireland, he went back to UCD as an undergraduate and did a degree in Celtic Studies.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing?
It's a measure of the man. It's a measure of the man.
I tell you what, though, this is why I'm fascinated talking to you, Gerard Casey. There is a breed of man who I feel there's a type of character that just isn't there anymore in Ireland, and I think it's to our huge detriment. An economist should absolutely be an expert in Celtic studies, or philosophy, or other cultural elements, and vice versa. I think that enriches the nation, but I think we've moved away from it.
It does, and I think both the fact that he did that, the fact that he was really approachable in the central bank. I mean, for example, after he stepped down, subsequently, we had a group of us had a twin parish out in Ballyrone. And I remember he had a big interest in developing nations, developing countries, poverty, and those kind of issues. And he came out to give a talk there. He took a keen interest in the reform of the prison system. And yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, he's just a rounded character.
He was, and he navigated us through a difficult period as well in Northern Ireland. That shouldn't be forgotten. He advised the government on how best to collaborate for unity. in whatever form it might come and when it might come. But his idea of economics really inspired me. It was
Yeah.
about,
Did he leave a print on you, Ray? Did he influence you as and the job you went yourself went on to do?
well, let me be very clear. I went on to be a teacher of economics. I went on to research. Most important of all, I went on to marry and have a wonderful family. Nothing else comes close to that. Because
No.
the country, people forget that economics is really about, in my view, about developing the capabilities of all of the nation, um, all of the people in the nation. And so that means using the resources of the country for the benefit of um, all sections of society and the whole rural urban issue. Now, I should say there were other people in Ireland around that time. One person I came to know, I thought I had great respect from, was Sir George Quigley. He was the chairman of the Ulster Bank, and he was a great man for the single island economy. He was a reflective man. You know, I was on the Northern Ireland Economic Council for a while, and I had huge respect for the way that he engaged with staff, he engaged with emerging economic material that would point towards a better role for the whole island working together. George Quigley was one. I think there were others like Porrick White in the IDA. I mean, there were people there, but you know what? When you think back even further, one day somebody went into the Department of Finance and they walked down the corridor and they convinced the then minister, I have a great idea. Let's dam the Shannon. Let's do it. And, you know, there were great people there with a vision of what was possible, and nothing was too big. And Ardna Crusher, it didn't come any bigger than that.
Right. That's what you just put in my mind, the Ardna Crusher. What a huge deal that was. And what a statement of intent and energy, right?
Yes, and what a, in a sense, what a commitment, because it took, I think it was 20% of the total revenue of the government to put it into the biggest feat of engineering pretty well in the world until the Hoover Dam. But what it did was it turned on the lights in rural Ireland. It turned on the lights. I suppose another man that I would have great regard for was Monsignor Horan, who, you remember, he was the parish priest in Knock. And Knock in the west.
Knock Airport, right.
Think about it, on. Think about it. You know, people in the west were cut off from Dublin or from airports and infrastructure that would bind the country together. Monsignor Horan was a great man, because when the economists were thinking of building an airport, an international airport in the west of Ireland, in Knock. I mean, what a man! I remember driving down on the to the airport in a rusty old Alfa Sud, which actually sounded much better than it was, and I got onto the runways, and I was so impressed with the vision of that man. So we weren't short on vision by any means, and it needed, however, somebody like Whitaker to hold up the light and to embed confidence in us. And you could see it in people who were in the institutions and subsequently went on different careers. You could see a growing confidence. But I suppose listening to Jerry Casey, and your other collaborators, I would very much agree with them. I think something was lost in the process whereby development meant secularization,
Uh-huh.
and that that that's difficult because you were ceding
Where did that
part.
tipping point happen, Ray? Was it the 80s where
I
it
think,
really
yeah,
went over?
well, it's worth reflecting on, in that case, Monsignor Horan.
Mm-hmm.
You have a parish priest in the primary national shrine in Ireland, and where a blessed lady came to demonstrate, I suppose, in a very tangible way, that in a way that has drawn millions of people there, that the poor were not forgotten, and that addressing poverty and inequality is the vocation on of
Mm-hmm.
economics. And in a sense, what he did was to seize the moment after a time and to build an airport that would bring families back together, would bring investment into the West, and would imbue us with a sense of confidence in our own identity, in our identity. And so those kind of people were around. But I think I would take the view that as time went on, we lost sight of who we were and who we were capable of being in order to catch up with a world which had already lost direction.
What could you, I know now that's it's difficult question now, but could you give us some? I just give us could you give us a sense of how that happened? Why did we throw it away, or how did we get to the point where we just wanted, oh, let's be like the neighbors, let's be modern like them, and why did we, or why did we feel ashamed? I think it's fair to say in some cases, and look at ourselves as backward, or some way, because I do really believe that. I know that from talking with the old men back in West Clare and gathering folklore and in another life, that I remember from my time in the Celtic Tiger how they were seen as backwards, like folklore, all this, we want to get away from that. We want nothing to do with that. We want to be like the Americans, the British, the so on, the so on. Where did that breakdown happen? I mean, I know it's a difficult question.
No, I don't think so. Most questions, most important questions, have a commonsensical or practical answer. The real benefit in what you were doing and what your dad is doing in that whole folklore thing is to preserve the memory of what formed us as a people. And very few things formed us like knock, but all of the other issues that shape our culture and our identity, they, in my view, were sold out on. And I would put it as frankly as that. I think the epicenter of that was probably in the most tangible form was the European the referendum on the Constitution for Europe. Now,
oh, interesting.
Well, let's think about it.
Yeah.
Let's think about it. Europe's culture was shaped by Christianity. Its most beautiful aesthetics, its language, its history is. I remember reading a book that put that very bluntly. Europe's identity was shaped by its Christian past and its heritage. And in the referendum on a European constitution, they left God out of the constitution. Now, for people who are listening, it's important to remember that God comes right at the beginning of our own constitution, and people have lost sight of that. But when Europe lost or pushed God out of the out of the conversation. They were doing a terrible damage and self-harm, because what was there to hold Europe together? What was to be the basis of our national narrative? What was the basis of our normative values? Now, I'm not saying that Europe was a perfect place, and I'm not saying, no, I mean, you know that better than I do.
Yeah.
It wasn't, but the identity of Europe as a Christian civilization with certain foundational values, when that was sold out on, and of course, in terms of the countries voting, Ireland voted against having God in the Constitution. And where I'm coming from is this, economics and politics is about values and about practicalities. It should be about what we talk around in the kitchen table, but that's been lost sight of, because look at the cabinet table and look at the lack of a unified sense of people like P.K. Whitaker. He didn't make a song and dance about being a very good living man. It was in his actions. But that informed public life. But when Europe pushed God out of the conversation, it was, in my view, an act of arrogance and hubris. And Europe has progressively descended into a state of, not of unity, based on what Europe originally was and how it was conceived of in terms of bringing peace and progress and strong relationships between member states. Look at it today on. Europe is, and it's fractured. The same Europe that grew out of the horrors of World War II are being replicated in the heart of Europe today in a war in Ukraine. And I suppose I have to say this both as an economist and as somebody who values Europe. Makes no sense whatever. What we're looking at in Ukraine is a war that was foreseeable and a war that was avoidable. And the cost to Europe of that war, and the cost of the ancillary things like rounds of sanctions that were never costed or tested, the humanitarian cost of that war is horrific. Europe wasn't about that. Europe was about working together. It was about the values of peace and justice. It lost that. And I think that process began, to go back to your question, when Europe rejected God and his constitution, because the end result of that was the people who wanted that to happen, and of course the referendum failed, the people who wanted it to happen brought it in by the back door through Lisbon 1 and 2.
Right.
They took a shortcut that really cut through democracy.
So that's that. In its, is it? I don't want to make it too simplistic. You've summed it up brilliantly. But is it fair to say that at that point on, we see that the EU is becoming more of simply a monetary union? You know, it's for financial benefits, and it's, you know, it's, as you say, it's lost its initial focus, which is people, humanity. You know, that God, like you said, a religious focus, which is really a humanity focus, or a focus on humanity. Yes. Is this what we're seeing? So then, just the evolution of an institution that's gone out of control, simply chasing financial end products.
It's in my view, it's run out of road. It's look at Europe today. It promotes a cult of war. Let's take a practical example. Europe is going to spend 750 billion euro on rearming. My problem really all the time is seeing where the rationalization for that is. Because I did say earlier, a great feature of T.K. Whitaker was the truth.
Right.
And being realistic.
Right.
And being concerned for the welfare of the people. Well, I'm quite sure anybody listening to this can think of better things that Europe could spend 750 billion euro on than rearming for war.
Well, do you know what I noticed too, Ray, and it's exactly onto what you're saying there, and about truth. What has been really disappointing to me, and listen, there's a couple of, people can have problems with it, but the propaganda and the fear mongering right now is out of control. And it started too with the war, how they banned Russia today, Sputnik. Now, I know they're Russian, whatever, they go through the government, but what it shows is that they were going to shut down any alternative views to what we tell you. You're not allowed to have an alternative view on the causes of this conflict and how it evolves. That trust us, just trust us. Now we see, just today, for example, the EU, they're rolling it out across all the news that that EU citizens should pack a 3-day survival kit in case of conflict or in case of natural disaster. And that's just been this banging, constant pounding of the drums of war that we've seen go into hyper overdrive since the Zelensky-Trump meeting in the White House. That it's quite frightening to see the bloodlust, the desire to have European young men die. And I've never seen that in my lifetime as a European. And just there, what you talk about, T.K. Whitaker, and this idea of truth and sincerity and clarity, that's completely alien nowadays, to be honest with you, to any young European.
It is, and they're right to feel that it's absurd because it's not what Europe was about. But I wouldn't understate at all on the importance of what you're saying about propaganda. I'm not pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian. I'm what I am. I'm a communist.
Right, I'm the same. Common sense,
Common sense, but you can tell a lot about the culture, the political culture, about the respect it has or doesn't have for truth. And the propaganda that is being rolled out, as you say, particularly in the press and across the British press, I would say, I noticed it a year or two ago when it talks about boots on the ground, and it talks about this absurdity that Russia is about to invade Italy and we had better get on board. It's one of the defining values of Christianity with which Christ self-identified is truth. And what we are looking at is a cult of militarization, which is predicated on a lie, and a cult of woke, which defies reason, and reason is so important. You're quite right. It puzzles me that people don't see through the lies, and that our political process is opaque to the truth.
I find it particularly hard to fathom as well, Ray, because like you said there, that Europe was born out of the absolute death, blood and destruction, absolute obliteration of so many lives. But we don't even need to think back that far see how dangerous, destructive war is, and how it always comes with lies and lies and lies. Because most of us listening to this will have lived through the war in Iraq. We will have seen and understand how the machine is rolled out in support of a war when people have decided to go to war. And I don't understand how people aren't drawing these parallels now. You know, people are falling for the same routine again, and it's depressing.
Well, it's also big business. The, for example, the total revenue in the last year of the arms industry is of the order of 600 billion. So if you turn to the statistics, the Stockholm Institute of Peace, and you look at the export of arms, and you look at the revenue that's been generated, and you look at the absurdity of Europe building a counterpart to the military complex, the industrial military complex,
right?
You have to say, what are they thinking? I think going to the diagnosis of what the war is about, that it's generated this assault on truth, this propaganda war. To me, I've got a paper coming out in the next week or two that looks at, well, it looks at the whole issue of where did it start, and it puts forward the idea and the fact that it started, in my view, there were issues beforehand, but it started, to me, when NATO met in 2004 and 2008, the Bucharest summit. Now, when you look at the Bucharest summit and the invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, even though the best strategists have pointed out that this is a passive aggression that will come to no good.
Of course.
All of the warning signs were, read carefully the press releases and read carefully Bush's statement at that summit, and you come to the conclusion that this was planned, strategized. It was a continuation of the hegemonistic approach of the West, and particularly America, it has to be said, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a willful turning away from a new world in East-West cooperation,
right.
a new world in Europe, and you had this outbreak of lies and aggression. That doesn't mean that people might listen to that and say, "Oh, he's pro-Putin." No, that's not where I'm coming from. One of the great economists that I admired is J.K. Galbraith. Galbraith was current in the 1960s. He served successive American presidents. He was a wise man, like T.K. Whitaker, and he wrote many books. He's very much embedded. I would call him probably the greatest American economist of the century. But he said in his last book, when he looked back over 50 years in Harvard, 50 years of public service, and he said this: wars are a major threat to civilized existence, and a corporate commitment to weapons procurement and their use nurtures this threat. It gives legitimacy and even heroic virtue to devastation and death. Where is Europe coming from? Now, that's from a man who was wise, a man who had seen over the course of his life in public service the devastation of it from the inside. And Galbraith was wise. How is it, I suppose, that at a time when we have a US president who is committed to ending the war in Ukraine. Why is Europe pushing back? Having failed to lift the phone and encourage diplomacy in the last 3 years, having failed to use diplomacy in the last 3 years, why are they pushing back against America achieving a humanitarian goal which they failed to do themselves? It makes no sense. So it goes back to your own interest in folklore and in tradition and in storytelling. Sometimes countries go through spasms of revolution and a loss of reason. So if you stopped at just this moment and you thought about Europe and you looked at what has been expended so far, the loss of life in Ukraine and Russia so far, the lies that have sustained this narrative, the failure to use diplomacy, Europe, beyond any country, Europe was conceived out of diplomacy and engagement, and it simply hasn't done it. And as you rightly say, it is driving a narrative of fear. I mean, for example, in Britain, Britain is cutting its welfare provisions in this most recent budgetary projections. It's cutting its welfare provisions to fund war.
Crazy.
But economically, it makes no sense because Britain is treading water. I don't like to see that. I have great memories of being in college in Britain and so on and so forth. But you have to stop and say, what's real? What's truth?
Yep.
What's reality?
Yep. Here in Germany, where I am, they're doing the same. That you know better than anyone that they have this absolutely brilliant commitment to overspending. That it's enshrined in law that I think it's something as small as 2% or that the GDP to overspend, they have this debt lock where they can't go over 2% or so per budget. And the new CDU head Merz, who's come in, and it's worth pointing out that the last government, the big reason why it collapsed was that the FDP refused to reallocate and shuffle funds to put up with the Green Party's net zero craze, and they refused to go to mess with the debt lock, and that helped lead to economic chaos that brought down that government. But the moment Merz comes into power, debt lock suspended for war. I mean, it's incredible. Like, this is their most cherished economic foundation.
Yeah. So a reflection of the lack of leadership in Europe. Now, I don't use the word generally leadership, because we all know that the literature on leadership is absolutely vast. And it boils down to some very simple propositions. It boils down to fact, truth, and data. So,
Ray, sorry, it just broke a little bit there. Could you give us that again? What? Truth and data?
Well, yeah, what I'm saying is, if you look at the collapse of the German model, and you look at Volkswagen, and you look at Chinese firms coming in and taking over factories, you look at the collapse of the German automobile industry and what that's pointing to. You look at the leadership in Germany and you see why that's happening. Weak leadership.
Yes.
And let me be specific on this. I can remember chancellors in Germany, people like Willy Brandt, who had...
Oh, yeah.
Brandt was a great man and a great leader because he looked beyond the immediate, and he looked at what Germany could be. You look at cold, whatever kind of foibles, human foibles they had, they saw the bigger picture. They saw the people. So Willy Brandt and those kind of guys saw the big picture. The present leadership are so consumed in woke. Point to me a leader in Europe. Macron? Keir Starmer? I see only one leader in Europe, and that is in Hungary.
Of course, right.
And I've taken a keen economic interest in Hungary. And why do I admire them? Because in 2011, Hungary faced the same problems as Ireland. Small open economy, banking crisis, economic crisis. And then there was the prospect of intervention by Europe and the IMF. Now, I should say I have great respect for the IMF. I spent time there at the IMF Institute in Washington, and the IMF, for all of their reputation of devaluation and hard practicalities, they're professionals. And when they came to Ireland and they came to Germany, they came with the same recipe, but unfortunately the two institutions that came with them were the European Central Bank, which had its agenda, and that unravelled in Ireland very rapidly. The discussion between the IMF and Ireland when intervention in the form of the Troika took place was icy.
Ray, could you what would you say were the three agendas there? So when the Troika rolled into Ireland, let's look at the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF. What were their agendas?
Okay, first of all, you have to look at the background, the turmoil in the international markets, the turmoil in the debt markets. It was a tough time. And the euphemism word there is adjustment. How could stability be restored to international debt markets so that countries can continue to function? Mm-hmm. Now, in my view, the IMF were the professionals. They came to it with a knowledge of Ireland, and they also came to it with a respect for what Ireland had done and was capable of doing. And I would give a lot of credit to the central bank governor at the time, Patrick Honan. I thought he knew what was going down. He knew the IMF. He knew how they worked. He knew how they trusted Ireland to put a package together. But the ECB were coming with a very different agenda. They were coming with an agenda of austerity. And the Commission was coming, in my view, out of its step with an agenda of power. And in the book Troikanomics, it came out a couple of years ago, myself and my co-author tried to look at this, not just in economic terms, but in philosophical terms. And I mean, one of the conclusions on was encapsulated in, I think her name was Lisa Hand. She was a reporter for a writer on the Irish Independent.
Yeah, I know the name. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, she put together a portrait of what happened on the day that the Troika took over. And as she described it, and you quoted extensively in the book, it was cold. Merrion Square was a pretty desolate position in that place to be. 3 unelected representatives walked into government buildings. The 3 politicians at the table, who were out of their debt, stepped aside, and Ireland was in receivership. It wasn't the IMF's fault. The IMF team subsequently said, all of this austerity could have been avoided. But things happened after that. We became dependent. And now, by contrast, Hungary, same situation, except probably maybe even worse because it was taking over from the socialist regime before it, and it had, from a long-term perspective, fiscal perspective, it had a frightening demographic crisis wrapped in. So a demographic crisis is not the photograph, it's the video of what is happening because your population is shrinking. Your labour force is shrinking. Your fiscal commitments into the future are unmanageable. So the Troika is three-person, unrepresentative, undemocratic team came into Ireland, and then they came to, we rolled over. They came to Hungary, and Hungary said, thanks, but no thanks. We'll take care of this ourselves. And they did. Now,
so did they not receive any bailout or anything like that in Hungary?
They received assistance, but the conditionality imposed was not acceptable. They negotiated a way out that capitalized on their capabilities, and that's what I said earlier about economics. It's about developing the capabilities of the country in the interests of the people. We rolled over on, and my own view is that Hungary advocated for the national interest. It advocated for relative autonomy. No country is autonomous, but you can negotiate a space around which you are responsible and accountable to the people, not to Brussels. Hungary chose that path. It resisted the fiscal bullying, the how could you call it, the relationship between. It resisted the attempts in recent times to bully Hungary into supporting a war.
That's right, yeah. They've been willing to take the financial penalties and everything as well over immigration, that they seem to be a nation who are just, how would you call it, self-possessed, self-aware, very strong identity.
Very strong identity.
And they won't
interestingly enough, it's an identity that's also St. Stephen or King Stephen. It's an identity that goes way, way back into Hungarian history. I mean, it's important to bear in mind the repression that is a feature of Europe at the moment, including Ireland, the imposition of restrictions on free speech, on advocating, as I said earlier, the dissonant voice. They weren't having that at all. And the threats from Brussels, and they're well documented in the literature, they're well documented in the policies that the Commission has rolled out. The attempt to bully a country that was the only one who said, we don't agree with this war, that was the only one who said, the sanctions being rolled out in Russia, for whatever reason, are not working, they haven't been tested, and they're doing great damage to the European economy. Brussels does not like Hungary, and it's made that very...
Oh, no, that's fair to say.
It doesn't like, but, they stand for peace, they stand for the family, they stand for, in a world that is tethering on the brink of chaos, they stand for reason.
But if you think again, it brings us back to this idea of propaganda. I mean, have you ever seen a European nation so labelled and reviled in the European white press as Hungary.
But it's not just the right-wing press. I mean, right-wing or left-wing are labels.
I mean, all just press in general, sorry.
When a country or when an institution says to Ireland, step back into line or a bomb will go off in Dublin. You'll remember that phrase?
That's right.
When a country or a commission that's supposed to represent Europe threatens economic sabotage of Hungary's economy in a draft document just a year or two ago, because they say, no, we're not transporting arms across to a war that makes no sense to us, and we stand for peace, the plant of peace. This war is wrong.
Ray, I like I said at the start, you're as much a philosopher and anthropologist as you are an economist. I know I'm going to ask you again a very unfair question, perhaps, but how are the Hungarians different from us? Why did they stand up when we rolled over?
Yeah, how interesting. We'll be looked at that in detail. Remember, when the Orban government came into power in 2011, they had experience of what political repression is and what it does. They were looking at an enemy that they recognized. We didn't have that sensibility. I think that's the primary reason. Do remember as well that while the press reviled Orban, mostly they haven't listened to him, and they haven't reflected on the fact that he won 4 successive general elections.
That's right.
And it's the only country in Europe to have democracy proper fastened into its recent political history. I think they're the two main reasons. Without us knowing or noting it, Europe has slipped into the word woke is overused, but you know exactly what I mean.
Right.
The capture of the civil service, the capture of our universities, the attempted control over schools. I mean, this is pure Marxism. If you want to destroy a country, if you want to build a different political culture, take control of the schools.
Exactly.
Because then the children will disremember.
Exactly right.
They will disremember what Ireland is about, and you can build on that. Hungary hasn't allowed that to happen. It's also got a very, very pro-family, pro-woman, pro-mother and children approach, and that's embedded in its constitution. Interestingly enough, if you go back to Christian democracy in Germany, you go to the material of the Adenauer archives.
Sure.
And you look at where Christian democracy in Germany was coming from. It's like reading a slew of papal encyclicals, because they had no problem in seeing what was positive about normative values. They had no problem in seeing the importance of national identity. They had no problem in seeing that family is pivotal to the cohesion of a nation. And you see that reflected in the vision of Christian democracy that Adenauer embraced, Adenauer and Schumann.
And again, that links back to T.K. Whitaker with his Celtic Studies degree.
Absolutely. And I think that link is a very important one. We have, it's bad to say, because one has to be, Christianity is about positivity and hope. If it's about anything, it's about hope in the future. Marxism offers a false economic hope. Adenauer and Whitaker saw a positive vision of hope in a country that understood patriotic nationalism, relational autonomy among countries, trade and collaboration. We've lost that in Ireland, and it's lost in Europe. And that own is reflected in the election results right across Europe. A rejection of a culture of war, a rejection of repression and controls over speech. People don't want it. But of course, if you have control of the political machine, and in Ireland you have cornflakes or Weetabix, whatever, you have two brands that are identical, you have no dissonant voice, except, I would say, in fairness, I would say Ample. But that's not a political statement. It's simply an observation. It's simply an observation. But the loss of that, the loss of a culture of life, of hope in the two political parties, people like Peter Matthews, who I'm a big hero of Peter Matthews, he was TD in Fine Gael. He was the brightest person they had in understanding the economic crisis, how it could be dealt with, how it could be addressed. He went over to the Bundestag and they didn't understand what he was saying because they hadn't been presented with the narrative. Peter Matthews noted, and one of the things he did that I have great respect for is there is a clause in the German constitution that says, it's basically a conscience clause, and you know much better, the basic law in Germany, the basic law, and that safeguarded politicians in following their conscience in matters of public policy.
Right.
People couldn't be leaned on or pressurized. Look at Ireland.
Oh, the whip system is vicious. It's a vicious whip system.
But it's not what we could be. It's not what we were reared with. It's not the best Ireland that we can achieve.
That breeds a colonial mentality or a slave mentality. Because if you look, I can tell you, I have a personal experience of speaking to some TDs, very well known Fianna Fáil TD, who complained about the actions of the 33rd Dáil, in the streets of Limerick, but votes accordingly the whole way. It's like, that's a form of oppression. I mean, if he's there viciously giving out about the party in private, but going along in public, that's not a functional democracy.
It's not. It's also, dare I say, and we have to be careful about these words because there are very good politicians trying their best.
Yes,
but we have a hypocritical system that screens people who can stand for office, screens people who can be elected or not elected. I saw the pressure that Peter Matthews, who was a gifted, he was the leader that Fine Gael never had, or the country never had, and I saw the pressure that was put on him. Why? Because he believed in pro-life. And the man was just a great man. And he wanted to bring over to Ireland a clause in the basic law in Germany that politicians would be protected in making decisions. I saw him have that as private members' bill put out, circulated, and they never gave it the time of day. I mean, what unspeakable arrogance. Where are they now? They are pushing Ireland away from its neutrality. They are ceding year after year responsibilities to Brussels. They have no confidence, and I would say, on no competence. Look at the streets of Dublin, that are our capital cities.
I
And
think
this
when
is
you have that oppressive system where first Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are guaranteed to get back in, the system is very much in their favour. But then when you have this vicious whip system where it demands complete compliance, you're of course breeding mediocrity. You're not allowing the cream to rise to the top,
Oh, that's so right. You were breeding mediocrity. Peter, he was the most courteous man, and he was the most learned man. I remember the books he'd be reading, he would recommend it. He would recommend. Mediocre he wasn't, but he was ousted from the party that he graced by lesser men.
So stop. Anyway, I could rant about it, but here's a question that I wanted to ask in relation to the Hungary-Ireland difference. When Ireland, after the bailout, so they made the decision quite clearly to just double down on the FDI economy. That's it. That's our golden ticket out. But also is what I find extremely interesting is whereas Fidesz, which actually started quite left-wing, have progressed right over time, and especially since their economic crisis. Whereas if you look at the crisis in Ireland, it was all leftist micro-parties that jumped up. So it's interesting that leftist micro-parties jumped up and they doubled down on this FDI economy instead of, again, looking for something, or at least trying to sow the seeds of a homegrown industry.
I think that's true. The examples we were talking about earlier on just give us a glimpse, a shot in the dark almost, of what Ireland is capable of.
Yeah.
But if you lose your sovereignty, if you cede your responsibilities to put the national interest first while doing the right thing by your trading partners afterwards, you're retreating into a cul-de-sac. I think that's where we are today. I think an important point for people listening is there an alternative? Well, it seems to me that we've had an election, we've had elections across Europe, they're pretty well unanimous. We have an election coming up in Ireland in November. We have a presidential election coming up, and it would be my conviction that we need a young family in the Áras. We need a young family who are aware of and sensitive to the problems of families in Ireland. Now, it is, of course, true that the constitutional position of the president is limited. The power resides with the Oireachtas. But a president that would, for example, use powers that are in the Constitution to say to politicians, maybe to address the House of the Oireachtas once a year and say, is this the best we can do? To challenge them in the way that Whitaker challenged the politicians of his era. I think we need a young family in there who will give of their experience and their impartiality, the potential of their children, that will give that offer that to the people of Ireland, because it's probably the only chance that you can see, unless the coalition that's there at the moment, which, let's face it, there are some good people in it, some independents, and I have big respect for independents like Tony Gregory was another hero of mine. I mean, what a man.
Yeah, we've been blessed, in fairness, in Ireland with some excellent independents over the years.
Yes.
I mean, it's the only avenue, I suppose, for the non-mediocre or the dissident thinker.
Well, yeah, but you know, the narrative that's spun by the mainstream media doesn't serve the national interest. It doesn't listen to people. For example, I wouldn't be the greatest fan of the president, of his philosophy, but I respect him for one thing. He saw what was happening in the case of Ireland being pushed into NATO, and he called it out. And respect to his wife as well, who a couple of years ago took the courage to write to the Irish Times and say, what the hell? People are dying in huge numbers. Families are devastated by this war. So I would say respect to President O'Higgins, but his time is over. I think in the Áras we need a young family. I don't see that happening, by the way. From the presidency isn't something that should be doled out to use your word, mediocre politicians who are fighting to hold on to a residual of power that they've actually bled dry of any significance.
Yeah, well, it's how they've converted the Shannon as well by just parking failed TDs, in the Shannon, and it's kind of gone the same with the Áras. Really, again, it's a way of parking party grandees, and just saying good luck, put them out the pasture.
But
and
I would
that's
say
so uninspiring,
Well, it's uninspiring, but I would give a lot of credit. Early was it last year we had the referendum on the role of the mother in the home. I mean, how mediocre, how unreflective can you be as a political entity when you have the four main parties saying vote to amend the Constitution to take mother out of the Constitution? Yeah. What were they thinking? But in fairness to the Shannon, there was a number of senators and a number of independents who stood up, and bear this in mind on that the two big parties tried in the past to abolish the Shannon.
That's true. That's true. The McDowell, Keoghan were very good on those two referenda. They did excellent work, in fairness to them. I would imagine that if it's not going to be an establishment character, that McDowell would have the best shot.
Well, I think there are.
He'd have a good shot anyway.
Yeah, but let's put it this way: I have huge respect for a couple of defenders there that you mentioned. He had an interesting tweet up today on the state of Dublin and the inner city, and it mirrors the national politics. So he will be an excellent candidate. But I also think there is room for.
Can you think of any young character there? I'll put you on the spot, Ray. Can you think of anyone that I'm trying to think myself of who could fit that billing of the young family?
Well, there is. I want to be careful and neutral here. I did meet a young family. Curiously enough, his specialism is Celtic studies. He's a broadcaster, and he's a man I have really a great deal of admiration for.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I was very impressed, but I leave it to him. He's a teacher.
I like where you're going though with that, Ray. I like the idea that the president should be somebody who embodies the culture deeply, and that somebody, and because that allows them then to transcend politics as well, which is something we need.
It does. I also see himself, both himself and his wife are teachers, and I see schools in Ireland as the frontiers of whether we will descend further into mediocrity, whether we will enable indoctrination, and whether we will see that parents are stripped of their interest in the quality of education, whether we will see them imbibing ideology, or whether we will see them embracing.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more as a teacher. I was a teacher for a good while there, and I could not agree more. Listen, Ray, I have to let you go soon now. You've been on a terrific amount of time, and you've been very generous. But can I ask you one hobby horse question here? tell me here now, please, as an economist, and as brutal as you can, or as don't worry. Like I said, I'm economically illiterate. So, what about this idea here? We talk about. I know because a lot of people that I talk to on X there, and a lot who would be listening to this, are thinking about. They understand that if the foreign direct investment model we have now continues unabated, with all parties supporting, as they do explicitly or implicitly, that we are going to continue to see the growth of industries like, say, big tech, which only recruits now. You're talking about that nearly 90th percentile in non-EU individuals and things. Is there not a way, Ray, that we could somehow bring the FDI, prune it to somewhere around mid-90s levels, where it actually was self-sustaining for the nation, for the people, and then can we not, through a series perhaps of tax breaks, incentives, whatnot, kickstart our domestic industry? Start with simple things like, for example, we talk what they gave 0% VAT to newspapers, for example, but hit hospitality, which has nearly 200,000 people employed in this country, with a 13.5% VAT rate. Have we not got things backwards there? Could we not give domestic industry a helping hand, prune our FDI economy so that it serves the population of the nation? I mean, why are we allowing industry to squat here and hire from anywhere else? How does that add to the nation or benefit the nation? Is there not a dual model system here somehow, or that could be looked into?
That goes back to the literature of about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when we seemed to be on the twin track. A dual economy was called. But bear this in mind, to answer your question. Dependence is never good. It's never good in a relationship. It's never good in a country. Dependence. And we have come to depend upon corporate taxes. And Europe has, in my view, rightly complained. And there is a different system coming in. Dependence is not good. Dependence enables, every so often, when there's a bigger budget surplus, a political system in stasis to engage in handouts. I completely agree with you. We need a different model, and I don't want to keep harking back to Whitaker, but he did provide a different model, and it was based on the strengths of the country itself. One of the obvious places to start.
Ray, I think you should do TK Whitaker a big service here, because I think a lot of people look to him as having kickstart the FDI economy, so would look unfavorably on him, not because of how out of control it is today, when I don't think he ever imagined anything like it being as out of control as it is today. I don't think he wanted the nation to get addicted to FDI. He just simply saw it as a way out of the brutal start. But I don't think he ever believed that it should have gotten, put from Celtic Tiger levels on an addiction.
No, he saw it as a way of encouraging an economy to take part in a global expansion, driven by trade, driven by mobility of capital. He didn't see it in any way, shape, or form as a dependence. Ask yourself this: what percentage does corporation tax account for in terms of total tax? Ask yourself, what percentage of corporate tax is generated by maybe the top 6 mobile companies? Ask yourself the question, how mobile are those companies? Very mobile.
Oh, yeah.
Ask yourself, how vulnerable are they to changes in where America's coming from? We're more vulnerable than we think. And
absolutely,
holding on to what's there. The business model, the Irish business model, I don't want to make an overstatement here, but it's flawed, and it's past its sell-by date. We need something that is rooted more in all of the capabilities of the country. Some time ago, I had the pleasure of writing a book with a very dear friend, Professor Vincent McBriarty. This was 20 years ago. He wrote a book on Ireland and the knowledge economy. And
very difficult to get, and I tell you what, I'm getting close to having to take a flight over there, come knock on your door, and ask you to route around the attic. It's that difficult to find.
I'm sure Vincent has 1 or 2 spare copies, but the key point we were making is that in the paradigm Ireland was moving into, the greatest resource that a country can have is its intellectual capital, its knowledge. It's knowledge base. Now, to us, that meant looking at countries like Germany or America that had vast multinationals with huge budgets. We didn't have them, but our argument was that we did have them in a form. The form was our universities. And I still have this question. Why are we subsidizing degrees and a culture in the universities that is scientific nonsense?
Yes.
And promoting degrees and research in this area when we should be turning on the lights for world-class research. Now, I would add that there is world-class research going on, but it's been crowded out increasingly by, as you said earlier, the promotion of mediocrity. That's where, in my view, we could start. You start with the industry that is profitable and that is indigenous to Ireland, hospitality. You look at the policy instruments that you have, which are tax breaks, which, Ireland has used in the past. Hospitality is a really good example. Why would you not exercise those instruments to boost hospitality, but similarly boost investment in our universities, because they are the source of competitive advantage that's there.
You tell me if I have this right or wrong. My impression from years in Ireland before I left, going through the university system, and from having taught in the German university system, which was a radically eye-opening experience, is that because of how our economy has developed, but most importantly, how it got out of control from 2004-ish on, how it became an addiction that no longer served the people, rather it served the big tech and big multinationals, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and their cronies allowed certain so that from 2004 on, it got out of control. And the way I look at it is that Irish universities have now come to serve American multinationals, when in a functional society, the multinationals should serve the universities, in that we are now producing just a conveyor belt of degrees to go out and fill the factory floors, when it should be the other way around. We should be saying to the companies, or the big tech, saying, love what you do, good job, but you'd be a better fit for India because they have lots of tech workers, whereas we don't, and instead be attracting in the types of multinationals that suit our worker base. For example, we're terrific in all things science. We're terrific in producing graduates for pharmaceutical, for what you call them, medical equipment, all of this kind of thing. We're terrific at that. So we should be focusing on our strengths like that for two reasons. One, it gives, when universities are slaves to the multinational, just putting out workers to fill these jobs, it's terribly demotivating for the workers. It's just a job. But when there's a sense that the multinationals work for what it sounds like what you're talking about with universities as knowledge hubs, that when they work for them, then they're producing graduates who are motivated to go into those industries because they love their job, their training, and by extension their job, and then they want to make sure that they're promoted within these multinationals. Great feelings within the multinational, but more importantly, you're going to produce a breed of graduate who feel fields, he sees all around him an industry that's exciting. He sees something that values his skill set. So he's obviously got to be more likely then to go into the private industry himself and say, I'm going to set up the next big multinational. Guess what? The next big pharma multinational is going to be Irish, not American. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and I think there's a couple of really important points there maybe we could end on. One of them is the quality of our public services, our civil service. Now, by that I mean a civil service, and we've had great examples in the past who've been open to enlightened, reflective thinking. A civil service that is captured by ideology and whose promotion is hostage to saying the right things in the right places, that's a huge disadvantage. And somebody, some party, has to be able to challenge that, because that's what Whitaker did. Yeah. He established his team, encouraged initiative, respected the abilities of people that came to the system to contribute to the country. So, I mean, that's one important thing. There's a very good friend of mine who tweets, Michael Clark, and he has really good insights into that culture that is a hostage to ideology. We were talking earlier, you mentioned Gerard Casey. Our universities need to be set free. One of the things that has really surprised me, whatever view you take of Trump, America was caught in it was being asphyxiated by ideology at every level. And Trump severed that connection and held universities accountable. Gerard Casey he's a man I hugely respect, and he's written on this and he tweets on it, setting our university free. So with a different civil service culture, with a different culture in our universities, with a prioritizing of Irish industry based on our vulnerability of our present business model. And also, you touched on it there on, and Hungary has this, where people are working, where they can get married without huge debt, without huge pressure. The country that you live and breathe and want to contribute to, it's crowding out families. And Hungary realized that. You know, people should be able to get married early. International investors should not be commandeering apartments and houses. We need to look beyond tired political rhetoric and to say our country is a work in progress. It's not in a good place. We need change, and we need political parties that dispense with the old nonsense and the paradigms that may have worked partly in the past, but have stifled a new spirit in Ireland that is conscious of its identity, has a culture that supports families and faith values. And I say faith values because if you don't have normative values, you have no protection against people forcefully pressurizing you.
Ray, I think that's a fantastic way to wrap this up. What a very hopeful message and a great summary of what's happening in Ireland and what can be done. So nothing left to do but to wrap it up. I would like to again thank Professor Ray.
I'm just a teacher. I research and I don't do academic. I really don't do academic titles. That was a period of my life which I really enjoyed. But I appreciate what you're saying.
Well, make sure, if you're listening, make sure to pick up Troikanomics, Austerity, Autonomy, and Existential Crisis in the EU, and one of many of his books out there. I just want to thank you again, Ray, for giving us so much time.
A privilege. God bless.